All right, great. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and also to welcome Dr. Mandaville, Peter Mandaville. I'm on the faculty in the International Studies program and a fellow here at the Boise Center, so it's great to be with everyone. And it's also great to see a lot of students from my nationalism class as well. So I'm going to read sections of Dr. Mandaville's bio. You can see everything online, but I want to sort of emphasize the fact that not only is he, a renowned political scientist, but he also is what we call a hybrid. So he has moved really comfortably back and forth across the lines from the academic space to the policy space. So to give you a sense of that, Dr. Mandaville is a professor of international affairs in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where he's also the director of the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies. So he does a lot of work on the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. He, from 2024 to 2025, served as the director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and the senior advisor for faith engagement at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which no longer exists. From 2022 to 2024, 2 years before that, he was a senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at the USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace,
which also no
longer exists. Okay, exactly. And before that, he has a long record of government experience. That includes serving as a member of the State Department's policy and planning staff for 2 years. He was a senior advisor in the Secretary of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the State Department for a year. He has also been a non-resident senior fellow at some think tanks in Washington, at the Brookings Institution, also at the Pew Research Center. He's had affiliations at the RAND Corporation and also CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And currently you are at the Berkeley Center, senior research fellow, in addition to your academic appointment, a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. So a true hybrid. He is widely published. He's a commentator in the U.S. and international media. Again, he's trained as a political scientist. He has a PhD in international relations and an MA in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent, and also an MA in international relations from St. Andrews University. So your footprint is global. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here. And Peter.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today, and to the Boise Center for the invitation to be part of your program this semester. The presentation that I'm going to give today is essentially a synthesis and overview of some of the key themes that have come out of a large multi-year research project that I've been leading at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs called the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. It's been running since 2018. And this project, when it started, was a little bit of a departure for me. Insofar as up to that point, most of my work had been focused on studying social and political movements in the Muslim majority world and transnational connections between them. So, these are largely non-governmental entities. However, due to the government experience that Dr. Prodrumo alluded to in introducing me, I had the opportunity to spend some years between 2010 and 2016 developing a clearer sense of the ways in which states around the world were increasingly making use of religion as an instrument of statecraft. As someone who focuses primarily on the Muslim majority world, there were, of course, already a number of countries that style themselves as Islamic states, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, that I had a sort of long and abiding interest in, although had never had the opportunity to systematically study the role of religion in their foreign policies. And so that's where this project began. And I am going to, in the course of my remarks today, talk a little bit about that comparative Saudi and Iran case study, the Iran side of it, of course, being of particular interest right now, given events going on in the region. But what I'm hoping to do is to kind of alert you to a dimension of Islam in Iran's foreign policy that usually doesn't get quite the kind of attention that other aspects of the ideological basis of the Islamic Republic does. After a couple of years focused on those cases in the Middle East, and with the generous urging of the project sponsor in New York, we decided to take the project global to try and produce a more systematic comparative study of how states have been using religion in foreign policy. And so there are a couple of edited volumes that have come out of the project, both with Oxford University Press. And one of the joys of the project is that it's given me the opportunity to kind of put together a network of scholars literally from around the world whose own work focuses on the role of religion in the statecraft of a variety of nations around the world. And as the project kind of wraps up now, this is its final year, we're naturally in kind of a mode of trying to take the vast and diverse array of data and analysis and insight that it has produced over the years, and try to kind of pull it all together in synthetic ways that will be of interest not only just to policymakers, not just to scholars, but also to practitioners and policy makers, and to connect that to the idea that there is a need for greater religious literacy on the part of foreign and national security policymakers. I'm also starting now to extract from the project the initial contours of a somewhat more theoretical argument that I am hoping to advance in a couple of articles that are forthcoming in the French journal Politique étrangère, as well as hopefully the Foreign Affairs. The Foreign Affairs piece is kind of very deliberate rebuttal of Huntington's Clash of Civilization theories that counterintuitively starts by observing that there is today more than ever references to civilization, articulations of civilizational identity on the part of a number of major powers around the world. But my argument, as you'll see, is that this is all happening in ways that, rather than revitalizing or affirming Huntington, actually I think provides further evidence that he was kind of fundamentally incorrect in the way that he has understood civilizations. So that's the kind of ultimate trajectory. And that material, by the way, is brand new. Like I'm trying it out for the first time here at the Boisi Center, so I'll be particularly keen and grateful for your feedback on that piece of it. So this whole project and the work that I do in it has been thematized in relation to the idea of religious soft power. Many of you who are from the field of international relations, political science, will be familiar with the late Joseph Nye's famous concept of soft power that he began to articulate in the late 80s and early 90s, suggesting that in addition to states' possession of sort of tangible forms of power, such as military power and economic might and diplomatic capacity, it's also worthwhile considering the ways in which the ideas, values, and norms that particular states embrace and embody can serve to exert influence on the behavior of other actors in the international system. So I'm starting with that sort of broadly Nyean concept of soft power, and then riffing on and bringing into it more explicitly religiously inflected concepts, such as the one introduced by my good friend and colleague Gregorio Bettiza from the University of Exeter in the UK, who writes about what he calls sacred capital, right? And so, this is a term that he'll invite us to compare with notions of like social capital, right? Well known from the work of people like Robert Putnam. But what Bettiza is referring to with this notion of sacred capital is the idea that there are certain states in the world that by virtue of the nature of their role and relationship to the history and evolution of particular religious traditions, have the ability to kind of harness as a usable geopolitical resource that history and that sort of sacred connection in the way that they exert influence on the international system. And so you put these two things together and you get kind of a working definition for the purposes of this project of what we've called religious soft power. So it's essentially the ability to leverage and make use of that sacred capital that certain countries have in order to exert soft power. I first became interested in this topic for actually kind of very personal biographical reasons. I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, the third generation of my family to live in the kingdom as American expatriates. And it wasn't really until I left Saudi Arabia that I began to understand that there were certain perceptions of Saudi Islam and the ways in which Saudi Arabia exerted influence globally, particularly in the Muslim world, by providing funding for and exporting certain interpretations of the religion. And so I realized that there was a lot of politics around this. There were, in the eyes of some people, Saudi Arabia's support for the export of a particular understanding of Salafi Islam was directly connected to the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So in other words, Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabi Islam, was a direct conveyor belt to terrorism. For other people on the kind of other side of the debate, it was more the notion that, they are providing support to conservative Islamic causes, but there's not anything inherently problematic about it. And so I realized that this phenomenon of Saudi religious transnationalism had never actually been systematically studied in any academic way. And so this project, its first kind of proper academic output was this volume here that came out with Oxford University Press in 2021 called Wahhabism in the World, Understanding Saudi Arabia's Global Influence on Islam. And so what we did was we commissioned chapters from a number of scholars based in countries that are often viewed as and talked about as being on the receiving end of Saudi-funded religious influences, to do close country-level ethnographic work to actually understand what those religious influences look like and what the actual sort of cumulative effect of them would be. My job was then to take all of that material and kind of produce something like an evolutionary chart that talks about the different phases that global Islamic export activity has played and featured in terms of Saudi foreign policy over the years. And what you do when you kind of look at the big picture of it is you start to see this kind of clear pattern, that begins in the early 1960s, that is, on the one hand connected to a genuine sense of religious obligation on the part of the royal family in Saudi Arabia, that as the monarchs of the country that contains not just the birthplace of Islam, but the two holiest sites in the religion, that they have a special obligation to support Islam around the world. But very quickly it does become political and geopolitical in nature, insofar as you can't not see the fact that Saudi Arabia, whose main regional rival in the 1960s was the secular national Egypt of Gamal Abdel Nasser, was certainly using its religious influence in ways to offset the ideological influence of Pan-Arabism coming out of Egypt itself. There's a clear further turn and pivot in this that takes place in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution in Iran, where you have a situation where Iran and Saudi Arabia become sort of rival countries, kind of claiming to represent leadership within the Muslim world. A lot of the Saudi support for religious causes abroad clearly is designed to counterbalance and compete with Iran. But it's not just exclusively geopolitical and state-to-state competition. When you look at the growth of Saudi religious support in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s, what you find is a story of rapidly shifting religious demographics in sub-Saharan Africa that Saudi Arabia is responding to in terms of requests coming from Muslim institutions and some governments in the region who are essentially calling up Riyadh and saying, hey, the Pentecostals are going gangbusters here, and we really need your help to come in and get a handle on this. And so you suddenly see these whole new vectors of Islamic support going to sub-Saharan Africa from that point that just weren't really there. More recently, that dynamic of competition with Iran has been very important, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Everything I've said up to this point with respect to Saudi Arabia, though, is kind of the old story. Indeed, when the book came out, my greatest concern was that it was instantly a history book with respect to Saudi Arabia, simply because the approach to these issues that the country's current de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has taken, has been very, very different from his predecessors. And so what you've seen with Mohammed bin Salman is an effort to kind of open new vistas of religious diplomacy that are focused on the idea of fostering coexistence and religious pluralism. He has sort of hand-picked functionaries that kind of lead this religious diplomacy activity out of parastatal organizations such as the Muslim World League, set up in the late 1960s, and heavily involved in the export of sort of hyper-conservative Salafi Islam. And I think it's fair to say that there's considerable evidence that there was some fairly prominent anti-Semitism present in the work that the Muslim World League was doing in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Now you have a head of the Muslim World League who visits Auschwitz, who gives speeches and puts out articles about the dangers of anti-Semitism. So it's a very different riff on religion. That said, in my mind, it's still largely driven by geostrategic, maybe geoeconomic logic, first and foremost. Many of you will be familiar with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 project, right? This is sort of Saudi Arabia's equivalent to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, one of these grand projects that sort of crisscrosses world regions, that in Saudi Arabia's case is primarily tied to efforts to reduce the country's reliance on hydrocarbon resources by opening up new investment and commercial partnerships, primarily with emerging Asian economies. Broadly put, it's an effort to connect Saudi Arabia to the world in ways that are very different from the country's previous transnational engagement. And it involves everything from not just these commercial enterprises that I've been talking about, but an investment in culture and entertainment, sports, right? Trying to establish Saudi Arabia as a major fixture on the calendars for golf tournaments, football tournaments, real football, like soccer tournaments. And as part of this, you also see the Saudi Crown Prince deliberately constraining the ability of the country's religious establishment to exert influence in society. The religious vice and virtue police have been pulled off the streets. Women are suddenly present in public space in a way that they weren't just a generation ago. And this is beyond just women being able to drive, but women being in the labor force. And again, all of this, in my analysis, has a sort of geopolitical logic to it, even though it's being sort of put forward as reform. And where I'm going with this in terms of where religion fits into it is this idea that if you're going to try to establish yourself as a fixture on global circuits that will bring audiences from all over the world to your country to witness these events, you have to be able to project a sort of kindler, gentler, more inclusive image. Like people of other backgrounds, including other religions, are welcome here. So it's a rather different kind of approach to where religion fits into the kingdom's external relations that we're seeing under Mohammed bin Salman, but at the same time, there's continuity in terms of being able to identify a certain kind of geopolitical logic to it. Let me move on briefly to Iran. And again, I'm not going to talk about the conventional story of the ideological model of Velayat-e Faqih and the custodianship of the jurisprudence that is the kind of basis of the state. Instead, what I want to talk about is a slightly different vector of Islam in Iran's foreign policy from the one that you usually get. Certainly, if you've been listening to the news in recent weeks, you've heard a lot about the idea that this is a state driven exclusively by radical ideologies and doctrines. What I think is not so well appreciated about the Islamic Revolution in 1979 is the way in which it was received and understood in many parts of what we now call the Global South, not as a revolution driven by very specific particularist Islamist ideology, but more the idea that Grand Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 was viewed by many in the Global South as someone who had found a new geopolitical pathway between the United States and the Soviet Union, a form of sort of non-aligned orientation, which rejected both the Soviet Union and the United States and the ideological basis of their respective grand projects as legitimate. So this, I think, helps to explain why Khomeini received a sort of positive hearing, not just in, say, Muslim majority parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but even in non-Muslim majority parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. And it's part of, I think, how the Islamic Republic has succeeded in positioning itself globally as a sort of purveyor of a resistance culture by riffing on and leveraging not so much the Islamic dimensions of the state ideology, but more around the idea that what Iran is doing in the world is counter-hegemonic and anti-imperial in nature. And it has allowed the Islamic Republic to form all kinds of seemingly counterintuitive forms of alliance and solidarity. So, the very close ties that emerged between Iran and Venezuela are part of this. You saw Iranian state representatives and activists present at venues like the World Social Forum in Brazil. You see Iranians working closely with anti-free trade activists in places like Bangkok. So this much broader array of orientations that is about kind of leveraging the anti-imperialism of the revolution, but I think is also, and this is where it comes back to religion, is about kind of deep reaching into the well springs of Shia history specifically, right? And the idea that the history of Shiism as a branch of Islam is a history of dispossession, oppression, and disenfranchisement against a tyrannical majority. And I think the Islamic Republic, in its public outreach globally, has done a very good job of repackaging the history of Shiism in ways that allows it to kind of position itself as a voice for the oppressed and disenfranchised. And you will see within its state apparatus specific agencies that were created to perform exactly this function, the Islamic Culture and Relations Organization being chief amongst them. For those of you who are familiar with and remember something called the United States Information Agency, USIA, during the Cold War, ICRO is essentially Iran's branch of the US Information Agency. It engages in public diplomacy. It's not talking to the governments of other countries. It's talking to the populations of other countries. It's organizing conferences, cultural events, that might have something to do with Shia Islam, but more likely than not, just have something to do with resistance and counter-hegemonic cultural production, art, music, and the such. Because we have to realize that if Iran is trying to export a specifically Shia understanding of political theory, that's only going to travel so far, given that Shia are a distinct minority in the Muslim world. But I think what Iran has managed to do is to kind of operate a multifaceted and multi-layered religious soft power operation that has allowed it to speak to different kinds of audiences and different ways. And I want to just cite one specific example of this that I encountered quite directly. It was kind of an aha moment for me. A few years ago, I was in Indonesia, visiting the National Islamic University in the southern Jakarta suburb of Ciputat. And my host, the rector of the university, was showing me around, and we walked into one building, and he kind of giggled and pointed off to a corner. And in this corner was this kiosk that had an American flag on it and a sign that said American Corner. And these American corners were a sort of public diplomacy program that the US government had been running, where they set up at institutions, universities in other countries, these kiosks that allow you to visit them and learn things about American life, and there's like picture books and videos and internet terminals. And this American corner was just shoved off in a corner gathering dust. Then my host grabbed my arm and directed my eyes upstairs, and I looked upstairs and I saw this. Welcome to Iranian Corner. And he told me that the ambassador from Tehran had visited the university about 6 months prior, had seen the American Corner, put in a call to Tehran, and within 6 weeks they had set this thing up. And I couldn't help but notice that where American Corner was shoved off, gathering dust, Iranian Corner was packed out. Everyone was in there. And so I naturally, of course, wanted to see what was in Iranian Corner. And it perhaps kind of spoke to my own biases of the time, that I expected it to be like a shrine to the glories of the Islamic Revolution, right? Like iconic posters of Khomeini giving fiery speeches. So I went in and found absolutely nothing of the sort. There was no reference to the Islamic Revolution at all. Iranian Corner was simply a library devoted to historical Persian contributions to Sufi Islam, an understanding, an approach to Islam that is particularly popular in Indonesia, and particularly popular within the mass movement branch that ran the university I was visiting. Right. So what this was actually was incredibly savvy, know your audience type public diplomacy. All they were saying is, hey, if you like Sufism, then please remember that our country historically has been a source of much of it. And to my mind, that's actually really sophisticated religious soft power operations. So I want to throw out those two contrasting ones. But here's where the project goes global, because this kind of activity, this use of religious soft power, is not by any means limited to the Muslim majority world. I was very grateful when our sponsor invited us to take the project global, because in the course of doing the research for the Muslim majority cases, we kept bumping into things that other countries were doing. So just as a quick whistle-stop tour through some of these. Many of you will be aware that there has been a very close relationship between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church over the last 25 years. A very, very, I think, interestingly symbiotic relationship, in the sense that the Russian Orthodox Church gets certain things out of it in terms of certain kinds of privilege and access within Russia itself. And then the Russian Orthodox Church is a very useful tool for the Kremlin in terms of cultivating certain kinds of influence and outreach in a variety of regions around the world, including places that you wouldn't naturally think about, like sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. You'll, of course, be aware that the current government of India is very much a sort of Hindu nationalist government, and that there are a variety of social movements and networks in India, but reaching across Asia and also into Indian diasporas in places like Canada and the United States, organized around this idea of Hindutva. Again, a sort of civilizational project that we'll come back to. China is wonderfully counterintuitive here, right? Because usually when you think of China and religion, you think of inherent antagonism, right? China's draconian suppression of religious groups in China, the commission of mass atrocities against segments of the country's Muslim population in its western provinces, and that is absolutely true. But at the same time, you see Xi Jinping, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, putting huge amounts of money into using China's history with Buddhism as a soft power tool. So the Chinese government has been funding Buddhist temples across the whole Belt and Road geography, particularly in those countries that have significant Buddhist majority or minority populations. More recently, in my project, just published a piece on this last week. A couple years ago, we started through some of our rumor intelligence networks for the project to hear things about the Chinese Communist Party making a play to project a sinicized version of Christianity to the global South. Kind of that would emphasize the anti-imperial origins of Christianity as a religion. And a collaborator in our project just last week published the first piece that kind of outlines what this looks like. So again, ironically, you have China, pursuing one approach to religion domestically, but then also kind of geopoliticizing China's own cultural heritage. Because when they do the Chinese Buddhism outreach, they don't talk about it as religion; it's heritage. And again, this starts to get back into the civilizational discourse, which is where I'm getting at. Brazil, too, all kinds of interesting South-South stuff in terms of outreach from conservative, evangelical, and Pentecostal groups in Brazil to their counterparts in Lusophone countries in Africa. The story of Israel in this regard is well known, but I think most interesting here is that the sort of conventional account of it has been Israel's outreach to segments of the American Jewish community as part of a sort of pro-Israel lobby. And what you've really seen over the last 20 years is a wholesale shift whereby Israel's religious outreach to the United States has all but abandoned American Jewish communities in favor of conservative evangelical groups that Israel feels are far more robust in terms of providing support for their cause. We can talk about the United States in this as well. We can talk about things going on with the current administration. Those of you who have followed some of the headlines coming out of the current Iran war will be aware that there have been significant reports of American military commanders directly invoking religion and eschatological framings of the war, talking about President Trump as being anointed by Jesus to sort of bring about something of an Armageddon moment. And there have been reports from the uniformed military that some of this kind of talk is going on. What I have in mind here is more just the ways in which the United States throughout the Cold War made common cause with everything from the Roman Catholic Church with respect to communism in Central and Eastern Europe. But you remember from the very beginning of the talk, the references to the Muslim World League, that Saudi-funded body. My research has uncovered the fact that in the early 1970s, when the Muslim World League was publishing these glossy Islamic magazines that it was circulating around the world, a fair number of the articles in those magazines were actually written by the CIA. It was a direct collaboration between the CIA and the Muslim World League, where the U.S. knew that, these magazines reach Muslim audiences in countries that the U.S. sees as being at potential risk of communist insurrection. So let's write kind of religiously inflected articles that are being used to kind of spread U.S. messaging, with these Saudi religious institutions being the vehicle for them. So there is actually that tendril of active collaboration. So let me kind of get towards winding down now. In a number of the cases that I've mentioned so far, you will have noted that the claims that the governments in question are advancing are kind of framed in civilizational terms, sometimes explicitly using concepts like civilization, but other times just kind of referring to civilization like status, which is sort of, I think, reconjured the images and claims that Samuel Huntington famously made in 1993 about the future of world politics being a clash of civilizations. But what I think we actually see today is something that does not at all correspond to the world that Huntington predicted. Because Huntington tended to treat these civilizations as closed, bounded units that were inevitably going to be at odds with each other. So, in Huntington's world, the Orthodox, Christian Orthodox civilization and the Islamic civilization would necessarily need to be at odds with each other. And remember, his data point that he's looking at for that is the collapse of Yugoslavia, where you have Orthodox Serbs, at odds with Muslims. But what we see today, though, is something far more complex. And it's something more like the creation of moral coalitions that organize themselves around certain kinds of value commitments, but that are able to parlay and mobilize those commitments across what would be Huntington's bounded civilizational lines. So, for example, you will see Russian Orthodox aligned family and traditional values groups working closely with Western evangelical Christian blocs, both of them reaching out to religious institutions, as the Russian Orthodox Church recently did, to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, to say, hey, you're Muslim, we're Christian, but we can agree that one of the greatest threats to humanity today is the way that the West is pushing transgender ideology and LGBTQ rights, which means that we all need to work together, right? And in Huntington's scheme, that's not possible. And so what I think this research and this project is helping us to kind of understand something about are the changing contours of what I'm calling belief in a post-liberal world, or belief after liberalism, if you want to put it that way. So the idea that international politics is not really organized around competition between civilizational blocs, but there are competing moral projects that are at play in the way that a number of great powers seek to exert influence in the world today. And part of that is tied certainly to the normative dominance of international liberalism, or sort of a sense of liberal universalism, a la Francis Fukuyama, to cite another one of those early post-Cold War kind of framers of the world for us. With the weakening of that liberal universalism, you have space for other kinds of value-based projects to exert themselves. And because religion, by its nature, is a major source of, narratives of the good life, of the moral life, of ethics, authenticity, legitimacy, and also, crucially, religion by its nature is a force that crosses borders. It's organized transnationally. It becomes an important part of this. So, this is not an argument at the end of the day about a return to religion, that people are becoming more religious. Religion never left. Religion never exited the stage. The kind of analytic and normative boundaries of international relations were configured in ways that made it difficult for us to appreciate and see it. But what we are seeing, I think, is, with the erosion of global liberalism, space in which multipolarity in the world is not just about, and we hear a lot about multipolarity today, it's not just about multiple power blocks in military and economic terms, but it's also normative polarity expressed through these various kinds of what I'm calling competing moral blocks and projects. There's a few more slides, but I'm going to leave it at that, just because I want to make sure we have time to have a good conversation about it together. So thank you all.
Okay, we have about a little more than 10 minutes to open it up for some Q&A. A couple of things, feel free to pop off and get some more food and return for the Q&A if you'd like. And I'd also really encourage you to keep your questions short because of the short amount of time that we have. And make sure they're a question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm always here for critiques of Huntington's work, whichever direction they come from, and there's lots that can be given. But I guess the simplest way to frame this would be, what does it look like do you see the sort of Trumpist nationalist return as something that challenges your argument here with regard to moral coalitions and legitimacy worldwide? Or do you see that as a blip or something that's well within your overarching argument?
Yeah, I mean, because you're right. Because on the face of it, there's potentially a tension between resurgent nationalism and these broader moral projects that would play across national boundaries. So I guess in my mind, I'm not trying to argue that as Huntington was, that these civilizational blocks are sort of the new unit of an analysis. I'm not trying to say that these competing moral projects are the new unit of an analysis. They're rather a resource and a mobilizing tool that can be harnessed by multiple national projects simultaneously. And so what I would look to them for is helping us to understand some possible contours of future alliance structures, right? Because, one can certainly engage in religious nationalist discourse as we see going on around the world. But you can also, once you've achieved what you want through that, you can also use religious nationalism or religious transnationalism that way as a way to identify and build certain kinds of global solidarity. So I think that by sort of refraining from positing these competing moral projects as a unit of analysis, but as a layer of geopolitical mobilization and discourse that are, yes, relevant to specific nationalist projects, but also possibly helping us to see the way forward to new kinds of coalition structures that we might see in a future world. That's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Would it be incorrect to assume that, sticking to Huntington, that Huntington's border-bound civilizations were stability, and the current activity involving religion, culture, things of this nature, are tools of chaos, specifically utilized to disrupt what are seen as existential threats to authoritative regimes, whether it's an oligarchy of petroleum, or religion, or the interest of returning to Tsarist Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I would. I'm not sure that I would necessarily posit these as kind of tools of chaos. They're
Certainly their utilization
yes.
produces chaos. In other words, just so I might make my question more clear,
Yeah.
And forgive me for interrupting you,
Yeah.
in that, again, returning to Huntington, you have this very geographical sphere, that's civilization.
Mm-hmm.
There's a stability associated with that. These spheres coexist.
Yes.
We're now coming to discover, I mean, you spoke of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini.
Yeah.
His revolution were cassette tapes.
Right.
Our revolution is now AI.
Right.
So we have this back and forth
Yeah.
in which there is no such thing as boundaries.
Yes.
And therefore the Huntington theory is thrown out the window.
Right.
And yet there still exists this sense of stability
Mhm.
which is threatening
Mm-hmm.
to autocratic states
Mhm.
that use the authority of religion or whatever.
Right.
And that they're utilizing these tools to continue to demonstrate, again, returning stability to what they now perceive as a different civilization border,
Yes.
to reject the West, to reject liberalism alike.
Yeah.
Is that not an incorrect viewpoint of your observations?
I mean, I would say that if you take what I've posited and then want to trace some future trajectories for it, that certainly could be one of them. There are aspects of this, however, that are not a rejection of the West, depending on what we understand the West to be, because the West is directly involved in some of this. In my mind, or what I'm trying to do with it is to think about the ways that this kind of activity, this phenomenon, inflects the current kind of global interregnum we're in right now, shifting from one model of global order to something else, right? International relations scholarship right now is all full of people trying to figure out what the new world order is. What is the global order we're shifting to, with multipolarity, seemingly being the most common answer. Although there's a really interesting critique in the current issue of foreign policy about why, what we're seeing today is not actually multipolarity in a real sense. But I think what I'm trying to just draw our attention to is the idea that in those moments where global orders are unsettled or in transition, there tends to be greater space and openness for people to engage accounts of what it's all about. A search for meaning, right? Because you need a new narrative to cohere whatever the order you're moving into is. And so I guess what I'm doing here is just positing that these kinds of transnational, religiously inflected moral order and values projects, activities are likely to be an important part of how that shift in global order plays out.
Bitte sehr.
Yeah, I have two questions. One question to the Iranian vector.
Yeah.
I studied in Lebanon 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
And when I arrived after 4 weeks, the October Revolution started. And it was very interesting for me because I watched every day Nasrallah on the TV and watched what he was talking like.
Yeah.
And at that I realized, okay, the superpower system of Hezbollah in Lebanon was at that time huge.
Yeah.
Like it changed a lot during the last years.
Yes.
I never expected that when I lived there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would be interested in your opinion about Hezbollah today, because out of a German perspective, I'm from Berlin,
Yeah.
and there was civil war in Lebanon 1974 to 1990,
Mhm.
and a lot of people flew to France. Christians flew to France because they spoke already
Yes.
French,
Yes.
and a lot of Islamic people, and mostly of them Shia people, they flew to Germany, especially Berlin and Hamburg, that's in the northern part. And nowadays we have a lot of Shia people in Germany, and we have, out of my perspective, we have a huge problem, like the whole conflict we have in Germany,
Yes.
because we have a huge community of Shia people, in Germany, your sentence "religion never left the stage."
Yeah.
It's not common sense. Like
Yeah.
this is a huge problem. Like
Yes.
I completely agree, but we have parties in Germany who think like what happened in Iran has nothing to do with religion at all. Like they have a completely
Yes.
different
Yes.
worldview.
Yeah.
And so, so this is my question. What do you think about the Hezbollah nowadays?
Yeah.
Because I think it's still very present, especially on this soft power level.
Yes.
Because they have hospitals, they have schools, they have the better streets in Lebanon.
Yes.
It's so present.
Yes.
And also for like also the relations, because I'm a Catholic theologian,
Yes.
also the relations from the Catholic Church with
Yes.
the Hezbollah.
Yes.
At that time they were better than with the Sunni community, which was
Yes.
also very interesting.
Yes.
So how do you see that? And yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a fascinating question, and I think it's useful in trying to understand the dynamics around Hezbollah to make the comparison with Hamas as well. Frankly, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as well, right? That most people think of, the Muslim Brotherhood as a political organization that had a political party in the aftermath of the revolution. When we think of Hamas and Hezbollah, people tend to think of the headlines that involve rocket attacks into Israel and the armed wings of these organizations, which absolutely is a dimension of them, but it's only one dimension of what is actually a much more complicated and vast network of social welfare services, schools, hospitals, local community development activities that benefit and are supported by vast portions of the population of these countries, even if they don't agree with the official ideology of the organization itself. And so, the degradation of Hezbollah's military capabilities and the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, certainly a watershed moment. But I think what's going to be very important to watch going forward, particularly as we see the Lebanese state now trying to be more assertive in terms of its relationship with Hezbollah and kind of getting more control, I can imagine coming out of this war a pragmatist wing of Hezbollah that emerges that actually finds some kind of mode of coexistence with the Lebanese state, because even though it's a Shia movement ideologically, Hezbollah has at times been very skilled at presenting itself to the Lebanese as a nationalist project, as much. They get a lot of skepticism right now, of course, because of the way they've dragged Lebanon back into this war. But when I think about the sort of transnational architecture of the Hezbollah movement, you've already mentioned, the diasporas in Europe. Hezbollah is present in West Africa. It's present in Latin America. It's I think, something that will be with us for some time in the same way that Hamas will as well, despite any declarations of victory against them by Israel and the United States.
Peter, can you tell us a little bit about where time scales fit into your understanding of civilizations?
Oh my
because I think I told you I just did a paper on this regarding Turkey, and the two cases I know best are Turkey and Russia.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting in all of the cases that you talked about is the time scales, which are pre-state and potentially post-state.
Yes.
Which then leads to, civilizational logic depends on long time scales.
Right.
And what does that mean then for how these civilizational projects affect states? Which leads to the associated question, who's articulating the civilizational discourse?
Right.
Who's controlling it?
Right.
And certainly we see state actors and religious actors a lot in both of those.
Yeah.
Who's controlling it, and what do these mean for how states understand the deployment of civilizational narratives for their own territoriality? Because in a case like Turkey and in a case like Russia, they use civilizational narratives to reinforce the existing power of the state, even as they
Right.
are interested in the revision of
Right.
territorial boundaries, whether hard revisions or soft revisions.
Right.
So how do we square that circle between civilizational discourses that precede the state,
Yes.
eschatologically can
Yes,
go
great.
beyond the state,
Farther,
and yet
yeah.
the state remains the point of reference? Is there a tension there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have a well thought out answer for it yet, just because the sort of competing moral projects piece of this and the implications of
Right,
it
right.
for worldly polities in the sense
Right,
of the,
right.
the actual states that are deploying and making use of these claims. Right, you've mentioned the Russian and Turkish cases. You know, there's the common quip by Chinese leaders now that, look, we've been around 5,000 years,
Right.
and so your cute little Westphalian system, that was a nice moment, but
Right.
let us show you how to do transtemporal
Right, right.
statecraft. And so I don't actually have a good answer to that. I've been really drawn to the work of public intellectuals like Pankaj Mishra and his book The Age of Anger, right, where he tries to make the case that what we considered to be the universalism of the international liberal system was actually an exception. It was a sort of particular moment that is actually inconsistent with some of the civilizational framed geopolitical discourses that came before it, and that he sees as being relevant once again. I suspect that to do this properly would be, it's like a Michael Mann style historical sociology, right, where you're identifying the moral civilizational narrative and project that appears at a certain point, and which then is expressed through different forms of temporal worldly polity, and finding the strains of continuity and inevitably divergence as things like the need to hold on to power find themselves at odds with aspects of the civilizational discourse. So the historical piece of it, I have a sense, that would be a great project too. What it looks like going forward, I don't know. It's very unsatisfactory.
Speaking of time,
Yeah.
my apologies, we are out of it. I encourage you to, perhaps if Dr. Mandaville is willing to take some questions after the end of our formal time together, that would be great. Please join me in thanking Dr. Peter Mandaville.